All right, so welcome to our fourth session of political ideologies. So today we're going to be going over the topic of conservatism. So we have three readings today, just like we did yesterday with liberalism and libertarianism. So we have these three readings to go over today. I have graded the first discussion board, so you can check in Canvas for your grades on those, as well as my comments. So if I took off points, I let you know why, and I let you know how to improve for the forthcoming discussion boards as well. All right. So I was generally pleased with those that I saw. One thing to keep in mind is that typically the grades on these will go up over the course of the term because students improve with their writing skills and they know more what I'm looking for in the discussion boards and follow the directions more closely as we go. So if you're disappointed with your grade on the first one, keep in mind that they typically improve over the course of the semester. All right. So also remember that we have the second discussion board coming up. So your post is due Saturday by 11:59 p.m. and then your classmate response by Monday at 11:59 p.m. as well. And that's on the topic that we talked a little bit about yesterday, which is positive and negative freedom. And you can invoke any of the readings that we have for the week. So you could talk about the ones relating to liberalism, libertarianism, or conservatism. So the ones that we talked about yesterday or today are fair game within the discussion board. All right, so if you have additional questions on that, feel free to email me. All right, but with that, let's get into the readings for today. So the first one that we have is the Russell Kirk reading, the 10 Conservative Principles. Russell Kirk was an influential conservative thinker. He founded a magazine that some of you may be familiar with, National Review, which is really one of the prime publications in conservative thought. And has been for quite some time. So National Review has been around for about 60 years or so. All right, but getting into his 10 conservative principles. I just want to address a few of these principles as we go through the text, what he means by them and how they relate to his overall ideology and worldview. All right, so if you go in the text, I want to highlight where he talks about each of the different principles. So where he talks about the first principle, the first one that he addresses is he says, first, the conservative believes that there exists an enduring moral order. That order is made for man and man is made for it. Human nature is a constant and moral truths are permanent. All right, so if we think about conservatism here, conservatism, he's talking about conservatism as really unchanging, that there are certain moral truths that remain consistent. So the ideology over time does not change to the same extent that other ideologies may do so. All right, so when you think of the term conservatism, conservatism is preserving, right? It's preserving things from the past. That's sort of what he's getting at here with the first principle that he talks about, is preserving those constant ethics and morals. Okay, the second one goes along with that. So the second principle he outlines says, second, the conservative adheres to custom, convention, and continuity. It is old custom that enables people to live together peacefully. The destroyers of custom demolish more than they know or desire. It is through convention, a word much abused in our time, that we contrive to avoid perpetual disputes about rights and duties. Law at base is a body of conventions. All right, so what he's saying there is that having these constant beliefs, these constant ethics, you're more likely to, or you're less likely to have conflict between people because people become accustomed to those customs, those conventions, right? So you can see how these words all go together. And this is really what he's getting at here, is that continuity is important as well. So having these traditions, having these customs, these conventions over time are important for the stability of society and for peace moving forward. All right, then if we go to the third principle, he writes, third, conservatives believe in what may be called the principle of prescription. Conservatives sense that modern people are dwarves on the shoulders of giants, able to see farther than their ancestors only because of the great stature of those who preceded us in time. Therefore, conservatives very often emphasize the importance of prescription, that is, of things established by immemorial usage, so that the mind of man runneth not to the contrary. So again, he's saying here that we shouldn't ignore the things that our ancestors brought to us, the things that they learned over time. We should build on that, but not neglect the things that those who came before us learned and put into practice. All right, so we should preserve those things. All right, the fourth principle. Fourth, conservatives are guided by their principle of prudence. All right, so prudence meaning knowing when to have restraint. All right. So conservatives, change to the conservative mind should come slowly. All right, because he talks about here the importance of tradition, the importance of convention, and that any sort of change that happens, it should not happen just on a whim. It should not happen by impulse. It should happen thoughtfully and over time. So change should come slowly, according to the conservative ideology. All right, then the fifth one. Fifth, conservatives pay attention to the principle of variety. They feel affection for the proliferating intricacy of long-established social institutions and modes of life, as distinguished from the narrowing uniformity and deadening egalitarianism of radical systems. So here he's talking more about moderation, right? He's saying that conservatives don't necessarily neglect any sort of intricacies or importance of new ideas, but rather they don't neglect the old. All right, so it's having this balance, this sense of moderation between old ideas and new ideas. So he's not saying that society should not move forward or develop. He's saying that should happen, but it should happen slowly. Okay. All right, then the sixth principle he outlines, he writes, sixth, conservatives are chastened by their principle of imperfectibility. Human nature suffers irremediably from certain grave faults the conservatives know. Man being imperfect, no social order ever can be created. All right, so what he's saying here is that you're not going to have this idealist system. He's looking at this from a very realist perspective. All right, that human beings are imperfect, and because of that, you're not going to have a perfect system. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives lean toward this principle of limited government as well, because of the argument that human beings are imperfect. Human beings are incapable of creating an ideal system. All right, so there should be things that are left to the individuals themselves. All right, the seventh principle then. Seventh, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are closely linked. All right, so this goes along with some of the classical liberal thinkers that we looked at as well. All right, conservatism and classical liberalism really aren't as different from one another as people would have you believe. All right, I mean, if we looked at people like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, for instance, one of the fundamental rights was the right of property, right? If we look at Rothbard as well, Rothbard, coming from a libertarian viewpoint, puts a strong emphasis on property, that the government's means of taxation, for instance, is, according to him, robbery, right? So private property is something that should be preserved within any system, and the same goes for Kirk and his conservative principles. Okay, the eighth point then is, eighth, conservatives uphold voluntary community quite as they oppose involuntary collectivism. And this goes along with a lot of the classical liberal thinkers that we talked about as well, right, with Rothbard. Rothbard talked about conscription. He compared it to slavery, right, so forcing people and drafting them into the military. That's sort of the same sort of thing that Kirk is getting at here by arguing that voluntary community works best. All right, so that the state should be restricted because the state doesn't always have the rights of individuals as a foremost priority. All right, the ninth principle. So the ninth, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. Again, this goes to the same point with regard to having a limited state, but also having some limits on direct democracy as well. Because what is direct democracy? Direct democracy is where people make the decisions themselves, right? He's arguing more for a Republican style of governments, and I say Republican with a small r, all right? Not Republican Party, but Republican in terms of people electing leaders to make decisions for them, right? So he's sort of arguing against this mob rule mentality, which is often associated with direct democracy, all right? Because, again, conservative thought argues that change should be made slowly. It should not be made rapidly or any sort of revolution. Changes should be made over time, all right? And within this sort of system, within a Republican system, small r, those changes come about more prudently and more slowly over time so that people can adapt to them, all right? I mean, that's one of the things that you see if you're watching, the presidential campaign. We had the first Democratic debate yesterday. A lot of people get rattled when candidates will say things like, "Oh, well, we're going to overhaul this system." right? A lot of people come back and say, well, wait a second, I like this part of the system. Are you going to change that overnight? And there's often a backlash to that. So what Kirk is arguing here is that changes should be made slowly over time. All right, and then the 10th point that he has is, he says, 10th, the thinking conservative understands that performance and change must be recognized and reconciled in a vigorous society. The conservative is not opposed to social improvement, although he doubts whether there is any such force as a mystical progress with a Roman P at work in the world. All right. So again, he's saying that change should be done slowly over time. It should be done prudently. All right. That this whole idea that we have of progress, and we can sort of transfer that to what people term as progressives today, is that these sorts of rapid changes that many propose, that is not the best way to govern, according to Kirk. All right, because you should not neglect the things that have been learned from the past. You should not neglect those conventions, those traditions that people have come to over centuries and millennia. All right, one last quote here that I want to read out from Kirk is, if you look at, let's see here, it's one of the later paragraphs. It starts off with, in short, the conservative interest appears to transcend the usual classification of most American voting blocs according to wealth, age, ethnic origin, religion, occupation, and education, and the like. If we may speak of a conservative interest, this appears to be the interest bloc of people concerned for stability. Those citizens who find the pace of change too swift, the loss of continuity and permanence too painful, the break with the American past too brutal, the damage to community dismaying, the designs of innovators imprudent and inhumane. All right, so that really sums up his viewpoints and how he views the conservative ideology. All right, so that it's people who want stability, and you can only have stability if you make change slowly over time, if you are prudent with your decision making. All right, because think about societies that change rapidly, that have revolution. If you think about revolution throughout history, what do we often attach to that? We attach violence and chaos, because oftentimes when changes are made swiftly, they're not thought through fully, and there's a lot of side effects that come about that people didn't foresee. And that's why he's arguing that change should be made slowly over time, and that a conservative ideology is really the way to go. All right. If you have any questions as we're going on, you can type them in the chat box. If not, I'm going to keep moving through the readings that we have for today. All right, so next we have the speech from Ronald Reagan. So I linked to his farewell address in Canvas. I'm also going to read just a few passages from other speeches of his, including his inaugural address and another speech that he gave. Just a few quotes to sort of give you an indication of where he's coming from in his conservative ideology. So Ronald Reagan, as you know, probably doesn't need too much of an introduction. The 40th president of the United States, one of the foremost conservative thinkers and presidents in modern times. But in order to sum up his ideology, I just want to read a few quotes from him, because I think it helps to understand his ideology rather than just me telling you. So from his inaugural address, so I don't think I linked to this on Canvas, but I'm just going to read a few passages from that anyway. In his inaugural address, Reagan says, "But great as our tax burden is, it has not kept pace with the public spending. For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present. To continue this long trend is to guarantee tremendous cultural, social, political, and economic upheavals. You and I as individuals can, by borrowing, live beyond our means, but for only a limited period of time. Why then should we think that collectively as a nation, we're not bound by the same limitation?" All right, so if you think about Republicans in government, you think about Democrats in government, neither party, I don't think anyone would describe as being fiscally responsible as of late, right? If you look at the national debt, if you look at the deficits that have been running for quite some time, but within a lot of conservative thought is this emphasis on balanced budgets, on restricting spending, on low taxation, right? And that's what Reagan is really getting at here within his inaugural address. Interestingly, Reagan, during his time in office, also did run budget deficits. I mean, this was really at the heart of the Cold War, which is one of the explanations for that. But This is really where he was coming into office from, and the sort of viewpoint that he had with regard to taxation, balanced budgets, and is really something at the heart of conservative thought. Okay, a few other quotes I just want to read. I want to read one from a speech that Reagan gave at the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals in 1983. So in his first term in office, he was speaking to an audience of evangelicals. And one thing to remember when we're looking at these different speeches is that each of these, the president, different thinkers, if you're looking at speeches on, they're speaking to a certain audience, right? So Reagan is speaking to an audience of religious evangelical people. All right, and this was early in his time in office. And interestingly, Reagan is not somebody who was always very open with his faith. He was not somebody who ran on that. Actually, when he ran for president in 1980 against Jimmy Carter was the one who was seen as the more evangelical religious person than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had been somebody who was divorced, didn't go to church every Sunday, but it was an audience that he nonetheless was attempting to appeal to. All right, so just a passage here from his speech to evangelicals. Reagan said, "At the same time, however, they must be made to understand we will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedom. We will never abandon our belief in God. And we will never stop searching for a genuine peace. But we can assure none of these things America stands for through the so-called nuclear-free solutions proposed by some. The truth is that a freeze now would be a very dangerous fraud, for that is merely the illusion of peace. The reality is that we must find peace through strength." And that's probably a quote that you've heard at some point before, right? That peace through strength. But it's interesting the concepts that he's putting it into here. So if we unpack this quote, he's sort of going back to what Kirk is talking about traditions, right? About the principles that we stand for as a nation. And he's tying that to the Cold War, tying that to the decisions he's making. And what he's trying to do is show how these principles, how this ideology plays into his decision-making with things as important as nuclear proliferation, all right? And that's really where that term, peace through strength, comes from, is from this speech, all right? So it's interesting to put that into that context and think about, the modern politics that we have today. Evangelicals tend to be associated more with the Republican Party today than they have been in the past. And part of that is because of this emphasis on invoking religion and using that sort of language within speeches. So I think it's interesting to look at the language of these speeches as well and look at how Reagan is attaching certain concepts to one another. All right, and then the last speech I want to get to is the one that you had posted in Canvas, which is his farewell address to the nation. I just have a couple passages from that I'd like to draw out in the middle of the speech. So if you want to do a search and find as I'm going through this, or if you want to look at the quotes later, you can do so. It's about halfway down in the speech. Reagan says, "I've been asked if I have any regrets. Well, I do. The deficit is one. I've been talking a great deal about that lately, but tonight isn't for arguments, and I'm going to hold my tongue." All right, so one thing that Reagan is getting at here, so we saw in the inaugural address where Reagan is talking about the importance of balanced budgets, of not spending beyond our means. But he acknowledges that that is not something that still continued to happen during his term in office. He says he's going to bite his tongue about that. Part of that may be because he was working with a Democratic Congress. So Reagan wasn't able to do necessarily everything that he wanted to. He was kept in check to some extent by the Congress. But he did pass tax cuts while he was in office, which a lot of conservatives praised. But spending was not necessarily reduced. And part of that was because of the arms race with the Soviet Union at the time. So there were a lot of factors, and you have to put those into context. But then in the next paragraph, Reagan says, "Finally, there's a great tradition of warnings in presidential farewells, and I've got one that's been on my mind for some time. But oddly enough, it starts with one of the things I'm proudest of in the past 8 years, the resurgence of national pride that I call the new patriotism. The national feeling is good, and it won't count for much, and I won't last unless it's grounded in thoughtfulness and knowledge. An informed patriotism is what we want. And are we doing a good enough job teaching our children what America is and what she represents in the long history of the world? Those of us who are over 35 or so of age grew up in a different America, all right? So he's getting at here about what patriotism means, right? And about younger Americans understanding what the country's principles really are. And it's interesting reading this because obviously we have a lot of different political ideologies within our own country. right? But there are still certain principles that continue to cross those different ideological lines, right? So it's important to pinpoint those as we go through these texts, because there are some things that I'm sure, regardless of what political perspective you're coming from, there are things that all of you will agree with, or most of you. So it's interesting to see, where these different viewpoints do come together and where they diverge from one another as well. All right, because even just today, I've been pointing out some similarities between classical liberalism, even more modern liberalism, which we'll look at later, libertarianism, and conservatism, because we think of these as being distinct political ideologies, but they do overlap in a lot of ways as well. Okay. The last reading that we have for today is the one by Irving Kristol, The Neoconservative Persuasion. And Irving Kristol is somebody who was an academic. I believe he taught at the University of Chicago. He was also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which some of you may have heard of, particularly if you've spent any time in politics or in Washington, D.C. Neoconservatism is an ideology that I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, or at least have heard the term, neoconservative, neocons. And Irving Kristol was really the founder of that ideology. He's typically seen as the grandfather of neoconservatism. His son, Bill Kristol, also is one of the foremost proponents of this type of ideology. You probably have seen him on cable news before, on Fox and CNN and such. He was Dick Cheney's chief of staff previously. So, the neoconservative ideology is typically most closely linked with the Bush administration, the second Bush administration. And people typically think of it in regards to, the Iraq War and those types of things, which is a part of neoconservative ideology in trying to project power globally. But there's a little bit more to it than that. So I want to get into his text here, The Neoconservative Persuasion. So if you go to the third paragraph in the text, Kristol writes, "Viewed in this way, one cannot say that the historical task and political purpose of neoconservatism would seem to be this: to convert the Republican Party and American conservatism in general, against the respective wills, into a new kind of conservative politics suitable to governing a modern democracy." All right, so one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of neoconservatives came from the Democratic Party. They came from the political left and then decided that they really didn't have a home within the Democratic Party, so they moved to the Republican Party. So they have tried to shift a lot of the Republican Party's viewpoints. So if you look at the Republican Party from the 1950s and before, it had very different viewpoints than we've seen in more modern times with regard to things like foreign policy. The Republican Party historically had been more of, I don't like using the term isolationist, but they were much more non-interventionist, much more hands-off to events in foreign affairs. When the neoconservative wing began to join the party, the Republicans shifted their perspective a bit. All right, Irving Kristol is one of the people who was responsible for that, and that's what he's getting at here, is trying to shift some of the Republican Party's viewpoints in his direction. All right, then if you go to the beginning of the fifth paragraph, he writes, one of these policies, most visible and controversial, is cutting tax rates in order to stimulate steady economic growth. This policy was not invented by neocons, and it was not the particularities of tax cuts that interested them, but rather the steady focus on economic growth. Neocons are familiar with intellectual history and are aware that it is only in the last 2 centuries that democracy has become a respectable option among political thinkers. All right, so something he's getting at here is that neoconservatives are people who actually, they're in support of tax cuts, but they're also supportive of boosting public spending to increase economic growth at times as well. All right, and that's something that may seem contradictory to some, and again, that's something that becomes very difficult to balance. And this is what Reagan was talking about in the beginning of his inaugural address in terms of balanced budgets and such, right? Neoconservatives aren't as concerned with that. So neoconservatives are more focused on economic growth. And their argument is that by economic growth, you can make up those budget gaps. You can make up those deficits. All right. All right, if we look at the beginning of the next paragraph then, Kristol writes, the cost of this emphasis on economic growth has been an attitude toward public finance that is far less risk-averse than is the case among more traditional conservatives. All right, so here he's sort of drawing this distinction again between neoconservatives and conservatives in terms of how they view fiscal policy and how they view the economy. All right, if we go just 2 paragraphs down then, Crystal writes a bit further by saying, but it is only to a degree that neocons are comfortable in modern America. The steady decline in our democratic culture, sinking to new levels of vulgarity, does unite neocons and traditional conservatives, though not with those libertarian conservatives who are conservative in economics, but unmindful of the culture. And this is where we really get to a distinction between what we see today between a lot of conservatives and libertarians, right? So if we look at Rothbard, for instance, Rothbard talks about things like prostitution and pornography, and says that these sort of victimless crimes are not crimes at all. They should not be crimes. They should not be things that are addressed at all by the state, right? They should be, they're free associations of individuals, and individuals can do whatever they want as long as they're not harming others. Crystal views from that, or veers from that viewpoint, and argues instead those things should be part of the lawmaking process. We should concern ourselves with values. We should concern ourselves with social lives of people as well. All right. And if you look at, Reagan's farewell, or Reagan's address to the evangelicals as well, he's bringing up values and principles. And this is what Crystal is saying is what unites neoconservatives and more traditional conservatives as well, is this emphasis on values, on principles, particularly on social principles as well. Because you would find that a lot of libertarians and conservatives do agree on a lot of economics, right? In terms of having limited regulation, having tax cuts, having a more restricted state in the economy. But in terms of social issues, that's where they tend to veer off from one another. And that's why a lot of conservatives are very derisive of libertarians. Like, you just want, legal drugs, you just want legal prostitution, these sorts of things. And they dismiss that ideology oftentimes on those sorts of grounds. Okay. One more passage I want to get to into the Crystal text here is where he's talking, and you have to put this into context during the Cold War. He writes a little bit later in the text, and large nations whose identity is ideological, like the Soviet Union of yesteryear and the United States of today, inevitably have ideological interests in addition to more material concerns. Barring extraordinary events, the United States will always feel obliged to defend, if possible, a democratic nation under attack from non-democratic forces, external or internal. That is why it was in our national interest to come to the defense of France and Britain in World War II. That is why we feel it necessary to defend Israel today, when its survival is threatened. No complicated geopolitical calculations of national interest are necessary. That is a key point with regard to neoconservatives and how they view foreign policy. So neoconservatives are arguing that our foreign policy should be based on values. It should be based on the sorts of values he's talking about in all aspects. He's saying that the United States and other large countries who have the power to do so should defend democracy, democratic nations, and those common principles and values wherever they're threatened. All right. And this is where neoconservatives often get pinned with having this more expansive foreign policy. If you go back in the history of the war in Iraq, well, what was one of the core motivations of the war in Iraq? Well, it was to make a democracy in the Middle East, to allow that ideology to spread, right? The belief was that if Iraq was made into a democratic state, others would become inspired within the region and democracy would spread, and it would make the world more peaceful over time. That hasn't necessarily happened if we look at the recent history in that region, but that was the belief going into that. I mean, the operation for the Iraq invasion was titled Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? It wasn't titled, to get rid of weapons of mass destruction or a defense of the United States itself. It was on this whole idea of spreading freedom within Iraq. All right, so that's a key point to remember here. All right. If you have questions on the text that we've gone over for today, feel free to type them in the chat box before we log off for today. If you're viewing this later, you, of course, can email me. Think about these different concepts. Try to bring them into the discussion boards that we have for this week. So remember, just a reminder once again, your discussion post, your original one, is due by Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Your classmate response, Monday at 11:59 p.m. I look forward to reading your responses. Be sure to check your grades in my comments and discussion board number 1. But with that, have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you all next Wednesday.